April 30th, 1967. Hill 881 South, Khe Sanh, northwest corner of South Vietnam. Captain Ray Madonna, Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, is leading his men up a jungle-covered hill that rises like a green fortress out of the Vietnamese highlands. Somewhere above him, dug into bunkers reinforced with 8 layers of logs and 5 feet of packed earth, roughly 2,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars are waiting. The Marines begin their assault. Mortar rounds crash into the tree line. Machine gun fire rips through the elephant grass. And then something happens that no amount of training prepared Captain Madonna for. His Marines start pulling their triggers, and their rifles stop working. Not one rifle, not 2, dozens. M16s across the entire company are jamming after 3, 5, 10 rounds. Marines are ripping the charging handles back, slamming the forward assists, doing everything they were taught. Nothing works. The brass cartridge cases are stuck inside the chambers like they have been welded in place. In the middle of a firefight against a dug-in enemy force, with mortar rounds falling and men screaming, Hotel Company's Marines are reduced to fighting with grenades, bayonets, and bare hands. By the end of the day, 9 Marines from Hotel Company are dead, 43 are wounded, and Captain Madonna, a man who would later retire as a lieutenant colonel, will say something decades later that cuts to the bone of this entire story. I will never forget how badly the M16 rifles jammed on us. My Marines used everything possible to keep them clean. Everything possible. And it still was not enough. Now here is what makes this story more than just a battlefield tragedy. Captain Madonna's Marines were not lazy. They were not careless. They were elite United States Marines doing exactly what they had been told to do, and their rifles still failed. Because the problem was never the Marines. The problem was built into the rifle before it ever left the factory. Built in by a series of decisions made in offices thousands of miles from Vietnam. Decisions that prioritized production schedules, cost savings, and bureaucratic convenience over the lives of the men who would carry these weapons into combat. What none of those Marines on Hill 881 knew was that their jammed rifles were the result of a scandal so deep, so systematic, that a United States congressional investigation would later describe the decisions behind it as bordering on criminal negligence. How do you take one of the most revolutionary firearms ever designed and turn it into a death trap? How do you send hundreds of thousands of rifles to a war zone knowing they might fail? And how many American soldiers died because their own weapon betrayed them at the moment they needed it most? Today, we are not just telling a war story. We are conducting the forensic audit of the most catastrophic weapons failure in modern American military history. This is the full story of why the M16 failed, and why the men it failed deserved so much better. Meanwhile, across Vietnam, in that same spring of 1967, the crisis was not limited to one company or one hill. In unit after unit, across the Army and the Marine Corps, soldiers were discovering the same horrifying truth. The rifle that was supposed to protect them was failing them at the worst possible moment. Letters were flooding back to the United States. Parents were reading their sons' desperate words, and the words were always the same. Our rifles do not work. Men are dying. Please help. And the Pentagon's official position? The soldiers were not cleaning their weapons properly. The rifle was fine. The problem was the troops. That lie was about to unravel. Because when enough parents send enough letters to enough congressmen, the machinery of democracy does something that no amount of bureaucratic stonewalling can prevent. It investigates. To understand how Captain Madonna's Marines ended up fighting with jammed rifles on Hill 881, we need to go back. Not to Vietnam, not even to the jungles. We need to go to a workshop in California, where a former Marine with oil-stained hands and a radical idea was about to change firearms design forever. And then we need to follow what happened to his creation after the Pentagon got hold of it. Because what happened to that rifle between the designer's workbench and the Vietnamese jungle is a story of institutional arrogance, cost-cutting, and willful blindness that borders on the unforgivable. Part 1. The Revolutionary and the Bureaucrats. The man who designed the rifle that would become the M16 was not a general. He was not a Pentagon official. He was not even a professional gun designer when he started. Eugene Morrison Stoner was born on November 22, 1922, in Gosport, Indiana, a small town that most Americans have never heard of. His family moved to California during the Depression, where young Eugene graduated from Long Beach Polytechnic High School in 1939. There was no money for college, so he went to work as a machinist at Vega Aircraft Company, a firm that would eventually become part of Lockheed. When World War II broke out, Stoner enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He served in aviation ordnance in the South Pacific and northern China. He was not a rifleman. He was an armorer, the man who maintained the machine guns mounted on Marine aircraft. He left the Corps as a corporal. Not exactly the resume you would expect from the man who would design the most widely used military rifle in Western history. But that experience planted a seed. Stoner understood machines. He understood how things break under stress. He understood the gap between what works on a drawing board and what works when metal meets mud. After the war, he bounced between jobs in the aviation industry before landing at Armalite, a tiny division of the Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation. Armalite was not a household name. It was a company so small that its workshop looked more like a garage than a weapons factory. And that was precisely the point. Armalite was not burdened by 80 years of, "This is how we have always done it." The Army had its Springfield Armory. The Springfield Armory had been designing and producing military rifles since before the Civil War. Their institutional culture was conservative, methodical, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. They had spent years developing the M14, a weapon that was essentially a refined version of the M1 Garand, John Garand's legendary World War II rifle. In their view, a rifle was wood and machined steel, period. The idea that some civilian engineer in California could design a better rifle than the institution that had armed American soldiers since 1794 was not just unlikely, it was offensive. Stoner did not care about their feelings. He cared about physics. Working without the constraints of institutional tradition, Stoner was free to think from first principles. And what he thought was this: the standard infantry rifle was too heavy, too long, and fired ammunition that weighed too much for a soldier to carry enough of it. Remember this detail. It becomes critical later. In the mid-1950s, Stoner designed the AR-10, a lightweight battle rifle chambered in 7.62 NATO. It was radical. Instead of traditional wood and machined steel, Stoner used aluminum alloys and composite materials. The rifle weighed just over 7 pounds compared to nearly 10 for the standard M14. The stock was in line with the bore, reducing muzzle rise during automatic fire. It was revolutionary. The Army rejected it. Why? Because the Army had spent a decade developing the M14. The Springfield Armory, the Army Ordnance Corps, the entire institutional apparatus was invested in the M14 program, a lightweight rifle designed by some unknown engineer at a company nobody had heard of, was not going to derail that train. Not yet. But Stoner was not done. Working with engineers Robert Fremont and Jim Sullivan, he scaled the AR-10 design down, way down. Instead of the heavy 7.62 NATO cartridge, the new rifle fired a tiny .223 caliber round, essentially a souped-up varmint cartridge based on the commercial .223 Remington. The bullet weighed just 55 grains and screamed out of the barrel at over 3,000 feet per second. This was the AR-15, and it changed everything. Picture the difference. The M14 weighed 9.2 pounds empty. The AR-15 weighed 6.35 pounds. A soldier carrying 180 rounds of 7.62 ammunition was lugging nearly 12 pounds of ammo alone. That same soldier could carry 300 rounds of 5.56 ammunition for the same weight. In the jungles of Vietnam, where every ounce matters, where you might burn through magazine after magazine in a single firefight, where the heat and humidity drain your energy with every step, that weight difference was not a luxury. It was a matter of life and death. Now here is where the story gets interesting. The Army brass did not want the AR-15. They loved their M14, but the people actually testing the AR-15 were raving about it. In 1962, the Advanced Research Projects Agency sent 1,000 AR-15s to South Vietnam for field evaluation by South Vietnamese troops and their American Special Forces advisors. The reports that came back were electric. Soldiers who could barely handle the recoil of the M14 on full automatic could control the AR-15 with ease. The high-velocity 5.56mm round produced devastating wound effects at the close ranges typical of jungle combat. Troops could carry nearly twice the ammunition. The weapon was simple to use, easy to handle, and troops loved it. Special Forces units begged for more. Air Force Security Police adopted it enthusiastically. Field reports described it as potentially the best individual weapon ever made for jungle warfare. But I need you to understand just how dramatic those early reports were, because they explain why what happened later was so much worse. It was not just that the rifle worked, it was that it transformed what a small unit could do in combat. A South Vietnamese soldier who weighed 120 pounds could control the AR-15 on full automatic. Try that with an M14. The 7.62 NATO round kicked like a mule. On full auto, the M14 was essentially uncontrollable for anyone under 180 pounds. The barrel climbed with every shot. After the second or third round, you were shooting at treetops. The AR-15 stayed on target, round after round, and the ammunition weight savings changed everything about how a patrol operated. A 12-man squad carrying M14s could take perhaps 2,000 rounds into the jungle. The same squad with AR-15s could carry over 3,500. In a firefight where the enemy was invisible in thick vegetation, and the only response was to pour fire into the tree line, those extra rounds were the difference between suppressing the enemy and running dry. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong took notice. They began referring to the AR-15 as the Black Rifle. According to intelligence reports cited during the later I-Cord hearings, enemy forces developed a genuine fear of units carrying the distinctive black weapons. Beware of the units with the black rifles was reportedly a standing warning among Viet Cong formations. But the Army Ordnance Corps saw it differently. These were the people who had spent years developing the M14, the people whose careers, budgets, and institutional authority depended on the M14 program. Having an outsider rifle designed by a civilian engineer at a tiny company make their baby obsolete was not just a technical inconvenience, it was an institutional threat. And so, the bureaucratic war began. Secretary of the Army Cyrus Vance ordered an investigation into why the AR-15 had been repeatedly rejected. The resulting report found something remarkable. The Army Materiel Command had rigged the tests. They had selected evaluation criteria that favored the M14. They had used match-grade, hand-tuned M14s against standard production AR-15s. It was not a fair fight. It was never intended to be. Think about that for a moment. The institution responsible for arming American soldiers was deliberately sabotaging the evaluation of a weapon that could save those soldiers' lives, not because the weapon was bad, but because adopting it would mean admitting their own weapon was inferior. This is the bureaucratic disease that would ultimately kill American soldiers in Vietnam. Remember it, because it is about to get much worse. In January 1963, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stepped in. McNamara was not a military man. He was the former president of Ford Motor Company, a man who believed in data, systems analysis, and quantifiable results. He looked at the test data, stripped away the institutional bias, and reached a conclusion that the Army did not want to hear. The AR-15 was superior to the M14. McNamara ordered a halt to M14 production. The decision sent shockwaves through the Army establishment. In November 1963, he approved a contract for 104,000 rifles. 85,000 would go to the Army and Marine Corps as the XM16E1, fitted with a forward assist at the Army's insistence. Another 19,000 would go to the Air Force as the M16, without the forward assist. Production began in March 1964. Now imagine you are Eugene Stoner at this moment. Your rifle, the one you designed from scratch, the one that was rejected and mocked and sabotaged, is finally going to be mass-produced, finally going to reach the troops who need it. You should be celebrating. But Stoner was not celebrating, because he knew something that the men making the decisions did not fully appreciate, or did not want to appreciate. The AR-15 was not just a rifle. It was a system. The rifle, the ammunition, the maintenance procedures, all of these components were engineered to work together as a single unit. Change one element, and you change everything. And the Army was about to change everything. Remember Captain Madonna's jammed rifles on Hill 881? The seeds of that disaster were planted right here in early 1964, when the first of 3 catastrophic decisions was made. Decisions that would transform Stoner's revolutionary weapon from a marvel of engineering into an instrument of death aimed at the wrong people. But to understand why those decisions were made, we need to follow the money, because in the end, this is not just a story about rifles and ammunition. It is a story about what happens when cost savings and production convenience are allowed to override the lives of the men doing the fighting. Part 2. The 3 fatal decisions. Imagine you buy a sports car, a beautifully engineered machine designed to run on premium gasoline. Now imagine someone tells you that premium gas is too expensive, takes too long to produce, and they are going to fill your tank with a cheaper fuel instead. They assure you it will work fine. They have not actually tested it in your specific engine, but it is cheaper, it is easier to manufacture in bulk, and they need to fill a lot of tanks very quickly. That is essentially what happened to the M16. The first fatal decision involved the ammunition. Eugene Stoner had designed the AR-15 to fire cartridges loaded with a specific propellant called IMR 4475. This was a stick powder, manufactured by DuPont. Stick powder gets its name from its shape. The grains look like tiny cylinders, extruded and cut to precise lengths. The burn rate is controlled primarily by the grain size and surface area. Why does this matter? Because the AR-15 used a system called direct gas impingement. When the rifle fired, propellant gases from the burning powder were channeled through a small tube running along the top of the barrel directly back into the bolt carrier inside the receiver. These gases pushed the bolt carrier backward, cycling the action, ejecting the spent case, and loading a fresh round. This was elegant engineering. It eliminated the weight and complexity of a traditional gas piston system. But it also meant that whatever came out of the burning powder went directly into the guts of the rifle. Every residue particle, every chemical byproduct of combustion was blown straight into the bolt carrier, and the chamber itself. With IMR 4475, this was not a problem. The stick powder burned cleanly. It produced specific pressures and a cyclic rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. Stoner had engineered every aspect of the system around this powder. The weight of the bolt carrier, the strength of the buffer spring, the timing of the extraction sequence, everything was calibrated to work with IMR 4475. In early 1964, DuPont informed the Army that it could not mass-produce IMR 4475 to meet the quantities and timeline the military demanded. The extruded stick powder required precise control of temperature, humidity, and cutting processes. Small batches worked perfectly. Scaling up to produce the millions of rounds needed for Vietnam, while maintaining consistent quality, proved impossible within the Army's timeline. The Army needed ammunition. It needed it now, and it needed a lot of it. Olin Matheson Chemical Corporation stepped forward with an alternative, WC-846, a ball propellant. Ball powder used an entirely different manufacturing process. Nitrocellulose was dissolved in solvents, formed into tiny spheres, and then hardened. This process was dramatically faster. A batch of WC-846 could be manufactured in roughly 40 hours, compared to approximately 2 weeks for IMR 4475. More importantly, Olin Matheson could guarantee delivery of the enormous quantities the Army required. There was just one problem. Actually, there were several problems. WC-846 burned differently than IMR 4475. The ball powder generated higher peak pressures. It maintained those pressures longer as the bullet traveled down the barrel. This produced significantly higher port pressures at the gas port location. The the small hole in the barrel where propellant gases were diverted back into the action. Higher port pressure meant more gas being rammed back into the bolt carrier with greater force. This increased the violence of the action cycling and raised the cyclic rate of fire from around 800 rounds per minute to between 850 and 1,000 rounds per minute. The rifle was literally cycling faster than it was designed to cycle, but the fouling problem was worse. WC-846 contained calcium carbonate as a stabilizer and deterrent coating. Calcium carbonate helped control the burn rate of the powder, but it left significantly more residue than IMR-4475. In a traditional rifle with a gas piston system, this residue would accumulate in the piston and gas cylinder, components that could be cleaned from outside the action. But remember, the M16 used direct gas impingement. Every particle of calcium carbonate residue was blown directly back into the bolt carrier, the bolt, the chamber, and the locking lugs with every single round fired. Now here is the part that should make your blood boil. The Army knew about these differences. Olin Matheson knew about these differences. In December 1965, Frankfurt Arsenal conducted tests comparing the two powders. With IMR-4475, the M16 experienced 3.2 malfunctions and 0.75 stoppages per 1,000 rounds. With WC-846, the same rifles experienced 18.5 malfunctions and 5.2 stoppages per 1,000 rounds. Let that sink in. The ball powder produced a malfunction rate nearly 6 times higher than the powder the rifle was designed to use. This was not a marginal difference. This was a catastrophic increase. And this data existed before hundreds of thousands of M16s were shipped to Vietnam, loaded exclusively with WC-846 ammunition. Colt, the manufacturer of the M16, protested the ammunition change in writing. Company officials stated explicitly that they could not guarantee weapon performance with the new powder. They declared that they were no longer accountable for the M16 passing the Army's acceptance tests. The Army's response? They gave Colt permission to continue testing rifles with the old IMR-4475 ammunition that Colt still had in stock. So the rifles passed their acceptance tests with one type of ammunition, then were shipped to Vietnam to be fired with a completely different type that had a failure rate 6 times higher, and no one told the soldiers. The second fatal decision involved chrome plating. Eugene Stoner and the Colt engineers strongly recommended that the chamber and bore of every M16 be chrome-plated. This was not exotic or experimental technology. Chrome plating had been used in artillery barrels since World War I. Aircraft machine guns in World War II routinely had chrome-plated bores. The United States military had extensive experience with tropical corrosion from the Pacific Theater. Weapons that worked perfectly in temperate climates had corroded rapidly in the humidity of Pacific islands. Chrome plating had been identified as the solution decades earlier. The process was straightforward. Electroplate a thin layer of hard chromium onto the steel surface of the chamber and bore. The chrome created a smooth, corrosion-resistant finish that prevented cartridge cases from sticking during extraction. In Vietnam's brutal humidity, where metal surfaces could develop visible rust overnight, chrome plating was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The Army rejected the recommendation. Why? Cost and production time. Chrome plating added several steps to the manufacturing process. Each chamber had to be carefully prepared, plated in an electroplating bath, and then inspected. Some voices in Army ordnance also worried that chrome plating might affect accuracy, though testing had never confirmed this for military-grade accuracy standards. So the Army sent rifles with bare steel chambers into the most humid, corrosive combat environment on Earth, and then acted surprised when the chambers corroded and the cartridge cases stuck. The third fatal decision was arguably the most reckless of all. Colt had marketed the AR-15 as requiring minimal maintenance. In the context of the original weapon system, firing IMR-4475 in controlled conditions, this was essentially true. The rifle needed less cleaning than the M14. But less is not none. And somewhere in the chain of communication between Colt's marketing department and the soldiers in Vietnam, Less maintenance morphed into virtually no maintenance, and then into self-cleaning. The Army took this characterization at face value. Soldiers received their new M16s with virtually no cleaning kits, no instruction on proper maintenance procedures. Many were explicitly told the rifle required little to no cleaning. Some were told it was self-cleaning, and that attempting to disassemble it might cause damage. Think about the sequence. You take a rifle designed for one type of ammunition and feed it another that produces 6 times more fouling. You refuse to chrome plate the chamber so it corrodes in tropical humidity, and then you tell the soldiers carrying it that they do not need to clean it. Every one of these decisions, taken individually, would have degraded the rifle's performance. Together, they created a perfect storm of failure. The fouling from WC-846 built up in the unchromed chamber, which was simultaneously corroding from the humidity. Cartridge cases expanded during firing, pressed against the fouled and corroded chamber walls, and stuck. The extractor tore through the soft brass rim instead of pulling the case free, and the soldier had no cleaning rod to punch the stuck case out because he had been told he did not need one. Every trigger pull was a roll of the dice, and the odds were getting worse with every round fired. Now imagine you are a 19-year-old Marine. You are in a jungle so thick you cannot see 20 feet ahead. The humidity is so oppressive that your uniform has not been dry in weeks. You have been told your rifle is state-of-the-art, that it barely needs cleaning, that it is the best weapon the United States military has ever produced. And in the middle of a firefight, when North Vietnamese soldiers are close enough that you can hear them moving through the undergrowth, you pull the trigger and nothing happens. You rack the charging handle. You slam the forward assist. You pull the trigger again. Click. Nothing. Your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your throat. Your buddy next to you is screaming. You look at your rifle and see the torn brass rim of a cartridge case in the ejection port. The rest of the case is stuck inside the chamber. Your rifle is now as useful as a baseball bat, and you do not have a cleaning rod because nobody told you to carry one. What do? That was not a hypothetical for thousands of American soldiers and Marines in 1966 and 1967. That was their reality, and for some of them, it was the last reality they ever knew. But here is the cruel twist. None of this showed up immediately. The first M16 arrived in Vietnam in early 1965 with elite units, Special Forces, Airborne, the 1st Cavalry Division. These were troops who received better training, maintained their weapons meticulously, and in many cases were still using remaining stocks of IMR 4475 ammunition. Their rifles were new, with chambers not yet corroded. For these early units, the M16 was everything it had been promised to be: light, accurate, devastating at close range. The reports were glowing, and that success masked the disaster that was building just beneath the surface. Like a bridge that looks perfectly solid until the day it collapses, the M16 appeared to work until it did not. The first major test came in November 1965 in a valley that most Americans had never heard of, a place called Drang. And what happened there would create a false sense of security that made the eventual catastrophe even worse. Because at Drang the rifle performed, and everyone assumed that meant it would keep performing. They were wrong. Tragically, fatally wrong. Part 3. From Triumph to Betrayal. November 14th, 1965. Landing Zone X-Ray. The Drang Valley, Central Highlands of South Vietnam. 14 miles west of the Plei Mi Special Forces Camp, at the eastern base of the Chu Pong Massif, near the Cambodian border. Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, a West Point graduate and Korean War veteran, was about to lead his men into the first major battle between United States Army forces and regular North Vietnamese Army troops. Moore commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, the same regiment, the 7th Cavalry, that George Armstrong Custer had led to disaster at Little Bighorn nearly 90 years earlier. Moore was acutely aware of the historical parallel. He had studied Custer's mistakes. He was determined not to repeat them. Moore's battalion of approximately 450 men, organized into 4 rifle companies, was inserted by helicopter into a clearing roughly 100 meters long, Waves of UH-1D Huey helicopters shuttled troops into the landing zone, which could hold only about 8 aircraft at a time. Within 15 minutes of the first helicopter touching down, Moore's point elements made contact with soldiers from the North Vietnamese Army's 66th Regiment. What followed was a desperate 3-day battle. Perhaps 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers from elements of 3 regiments attacked the landing zone in waves. Fighting was at point-blank range, in some cases hand-to-hand. American soldiers fired their M16s on full automatic, burning through magazine after magazine, and the rifles worked. Why did they work at Drang when they would fail so catastrophically later? This is the critical question, and the answer reveals the entire mechanism of the disaster that was about to unfold. First, Moore's men were elite airmobile soldiers. The 1st Cavalry Division was the Army's showcase unit, the spearhead of a new doctrine built around helicopter mobility. These soldiers had received more training time with the M16 than any conventional infantry unit would get in the coming year. They knew the weapon. They maintained it instinctively. Second, many of the rifles were brand new. The chambers had not yet been exposed to weeks and months of tropical humidity. There was no corrosion yet. The steel surfaces were still clean and smooth. Third, and this is the detail that changes everything, some of the ammunition at Drang was still loaded with the original IMR 4475 stick powder, the good powder, the powder the rifle was designed for. Remaining stocks of IMR 4475 ammunition were being consumed before the full switchover to WC846 ball powder. Moore's troops may have been firing the last of the ammunition that actually worked properly with their rifles. Strip away any one of those 3 advantages and you get a different result. Strip away all 3, which is exactly what happened to conventional infantry units arriving in Vietnam throughout 1966, and you get a catastrophe. Moore had ordered his men to carry as much ammunition as possible. Many soldiers carried 300 to 400 rounds. Sergeant Ernie Savage, who held a critical position on the perimeter throughout the battle, later recalled the experience. He had about 30 magazines in his pack and experienced no problems with his M16. In Moore's own assessment, the M16's lightweight and high ammunition capacity were determining factors in the battalion's survival. The rifle's low recoil allowed accurate automatic fire even under the stress and chaos of close combat. American firepower, combined with artillery support and tactical airstrikes, prevented the North Vietnamese from overrunning the landing zone. Drang was a victory for the 1st Cavalry Division, and it appeared to be a validation of the M16. But Drang was the best-case scenario, and the men who fought there had no way of knowing how many things had gone right that would go terribly wrong in the months ahead. Moore's troops were an elite airmobile division. They had received better training on the M16 than the conventional infantry units that would follow them to Vietnam. They maintained their weapons carefully. Many of their rifles were relatively new, with chambers not yet degraded by corrosion, and critically, some of the ammunition used at Drang was still loaded with IMR 4475, the powder the rifle was designed for. Strip away those advantages one by one, and you get a completely different story. By mid-1966, the M16 was being issued to conventional infantry units across Vietnam, not just elite airborne and airmobile troops, but regular Army infantrymen and Marines who had trained on the M14 in basic training and received their M16s in country with little more than a cursory introduction. The ammunition was now exclusively WC846 ball powder. The rifles were being used in sustained combat operations in the most hostile climate on Earth, and they started dying, not the enemy. The rifles. The reports began filtering in from units across Vietnam during the summer of 1966. Rifles that jammed after firing just a few rounds. Officers filing complaints that their men had lost confidence in their primary weapon. Wounded soldiers arriving at medical evacuation points describing rifles that failed at the moment they needed them most. The pattern was always the same. A unit would make contact with the enemy. Soldiers would begin firing. Within minutes, sometimes within seconds, rifles would start locking up. 1 here, 2 there. then 5, then a dozen. An infantry platoon that was supposed to be putting 40 rifles worth of fire on the enemy would suddenly have 25 working weapons, then 20, then 15, and the Viet Cong noticed. According to intelligence reports compiled after the war, enemy forces quickly learned to identify the moments when M16 malfunctions reduced American firepower. During sustained firefights, when the distinctive sound of M16 fire began to thin out as rifles jammed one by one, the enemy would launch assaults. They could hear the American fire rate dropping. They knew what it meant. The Americans were losing rifles. This was the moment to attack. Imagine being the squad leader who realizes what is happening. Your men are calling out jam one after another. The volume of fire from your position is visibly, audibly dropping, and across the clearing, through the trees, you can see the enemy massing for a rush. They can hear it too. They know you are weakening, and you cannot stop it. When a United States Army Weapons Command survey team visited Vietnam in 1966, they reported something revealing. The M16S of the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and the 5th Special Forces were well maintained and functioning, but these were elite units that had prior training on the M16 and understood its maintenance requirements. The rifles carried by regular infantry and marine units, the vast majority of weapons in theater, were poorly maintained, not because the soldiers were lazy or incompetent, because they had been told the rifle did not need maintenance, because they had not been given cleaning kits, because no one had trained them on what to do when the rifle they were told was self-cleaning started to jam. The failure pattern became grimly predictable. A soldier would fire 10, maybe 20 rounds. The rifle would cycle, and then stop. The bolt carrier would attempt to extract the spent cartridge case, but the brass case would stick in the fouled, corroded chamber. The extractor, a small hook of spring steel, would tear through the soft brass rim rather than pulling the case free. The torn rim would eject, but the body of the cartridge would remain wedged in the chamber. A fresh round would feed forward from the magazine, collide with the stuck case, and the entire action would lock up. The rifle was now a club. The only way to clear this malfunction was to insert a cleaning rod down the barrel from the muzzle and punch the stuck case out backward. This required removing the magazine, locking the bolt to the rear, inserting a cleaning rod down the 20-inch barrel, and forcefully driving the stuck case out through the ejection port. This required both hands, at least 30 seconds even for an experienced soldier, and left the man completely defenseless. In a jungle firefight where the enemy might be 5 feet away in thick vegetation, 30 seconds without a working weapon was a death sentence. And here is what made it worse. The malfunction did not happen once per firefight. It happened repeatedly. A soldier might clear the jam, fire 3 more rounds, and have the rifle jam again. Some soldiers reported their rifles jamming 10 times in 40 rounds. Imagine that rhythm. Fire, jam, clear, fire, jam, clear, while bullets are cracking past your head, while your squad leader is screaming for suppressive fire, while the man next to you goes down. Some soldiers began carrying grenades as their primary weapon, with the rifle as backup. Others carried knives and bayonets, knowing they might need them. The psychological toll was devastating. A soldier's rifle is supposed to be the one thing he can count on. It is the tool that stands between him and death. When that tool fails, the sense of betrayal is overwhelming. You do not just lose confidence in the weapon. You lose confidence in the institution that gave it to you. In October 1966, the commanding officer of 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry, 1st Infantry Division, filed an official report stating that the new XM16E1 rifles were experiencing malfunctions to the extent that confidence has been degraded. His battalion had lost men in firefights when their rifles failed. The carefully worded military language could not disguise the raw fury underneath. Soldiers were dying because their weapons did not work. One letter, sent by a Marine officer to Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, cut through the bureaucratic language entirely. The weapon has failed us at crucial moments when we needed firepower most. It left Marines naked against their enemies. And this is no exaggeration. As many as 60% of the rifles failed to operate. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles. Within 10 feet, close enough to see the face of the man who killed you, close enough that a working rifle would have meant survival. Another letter from a Marine reached home with words that would haunt the families who read them. You know what killed most of us? Our own rifles. The M16. Practically every one of our dead was found with his rifle torn down next to him where he had been trying to fix it. Picture that scene. American Marines lying dead in the jungle, their rifles disassembled around them. Not killed while fighting. Killed while desperately trying to unjam their weapons. These were not men who panicked. These were trained United States Marines who, in the last seconds of their lives, were methodically attempting to clear a malfunction. They died doing maintenance. These letters did something that no official report could do. They reached mothers, fathers, wives, and those family members did something that soldiers in the chain of command could not do without risking their careers. They wrote to their congressmen. They wrote to their senators. They called newspaper editors. They demanded answers. Small-town newspapers across America began running excerpts from soldiers' letters alongside school photos of the boys who had written them. A letter from a 20-year-old Marine about his jammed rifle, printed next to his high school graduation picture, is a powerful image. Multiply it by hundreds, and you have a political crisis that no amount of Pentagon public relations can contain. The families did not understand propellant chemistry or gas impingement systems. They understood one thing. Their sons had been given weapons that did not work, and they wanted to know who was responsible. In December 1966, the Marine Corps conducted a formal survey of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, after a series of engagements where rifle failures had caused casualties. The battalion had been involved in Operation Prairie, fighting near the demilitarized zone. The results were devastating. Approximately 80% of the 1,585 troops surveyed reported experiencing stoppages during combat. Many reported their rifles jamming after fewer than 10 rounds. Some reported firing only 3 or 4 rounds before complete weapon failure. Failure to extract the stuck cartridge case that had become the M16's signature malfunction accounted for roughly 80 to 90% of all stoppages. Let that number settle in. 80%. In a battalion of Marines heading into combat, 4 out of every 5 men could expect their rifle to jam at some point during the engagement. 4 out of 5. How do you plan a firefight when the odds say your weapon will fail? How do you ask a man to walk point, to be the first into the unknown, when his rifle has a 4 in 5 chance of failing at the worst possible moment? The psychological damage was as devastating as the physical danger. A soldier who does not trust his weapon fights differently. He conserves ammunition, firing in short bursts instead of sustained fire. He positions himself closer to cover, ready to dive behind something when the inevitable jam comes. He carries backup weapons, grenades, a knife, anything that does not depend on a firing pin hitting a primer. He fights scared, not scared of the enemy, scared of his own rifle. And then there was the story that became a symbol of the entire crisis. During one engagement, multiple Marines in a single squad experienced extraction failures simultaneously. The squad's ability to return fire collapsed in seconds. One Marine corporal was the only man in his squad who had managed to obtain a cleaning rod, apparently by trading with another unit. Under fire, this corporal ran from position to position along his squad's line, using his cleaning rod to punch stuck cases out of his fellow Marines' chambers. He would reach a man, ram the rod down the barrel, pop the stuck case free, hand the rifle back, and sprint to the next jammed weapon. He was keeping his entire squad in the fight with a single aluminum rod. He was shot and killed while clearing a jam from another Marine's rifle. His own rifle, functioning properly, was found next to his body. He died keeping his squad in the fight. Think about the layers of failure in that single moment. A Marine had to trade for a cleaning rod that should have been issued. He had to run through enemy fire to perform a function that should have been unnecessary. He died doing a job that should not have existed. Every link in the chain that put him in that position was a decision made by someone in an office who would never face the consequences. Let that image settle in your mind. A United States Marine, under enemy fire, running from man to man with a cleaning rod, because his government had told his buddies they did not need one, and dying for it. Meanwhile, the enemy had no such problems. The AK-47, designed in the Soviet Union by Mikhail Kalashnikov and adopted in 1947, used a fundamentally different operating system. Where the M16 channeled hot, fouling-laden gases directly into its action, the AK used a long-stroke gas piston. Propellant gases drove a piston that was physically separate from the bolt carrier. The fouling stayed in the gas tube and piston. It never entered the action. The AK was also built with deliberately loose tolerances. Dirt and debris fell through the gaps instead of binding the mechanism. The magazine was curved and designed to feed even when dented or filthy. Kalashnikov had designed the weapon based on his experience as a Soviet tank commander in World War II. He knew that soldiers in combat could not maintain their weapons with laboratory precision. He designed a rifle that would fire regardless. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters maintained their AK-47s poorly, if at all. Weapons were stored in underground caches, exposed to water, mud, and humidity for months. They were carried through rivers, dropped in rice paddies, buried when units retreated, and they fired nearly every time. An AK could be pulled from a muddy stream. The bolt cycled once to clear water from the action, and the weapon would fire. American soldiers witnessed this firsthand. They recovered enemy weapons from underground caches that had been submerged in water, coated in mud, left for weeks in the tropical jungle. Pull the bolt back, let it slam forward, pull the trigger. Bang! Their own M16S jammed if the humidity was particularly bad that day. American soldiers noticed the contrast immediately. They started picking up AK-47s from dead enemy soldiers. Officially carrying enemy weapons was prohibited. American ammunition was not compatible, and carrying an AK could lead to friendly fire incidents. Unofficially, many squad leaders allowed or even encouraged their men to carry captured AKs as backup. Some soldiers carried both weapons, using the M16 until it jammed, and then switching to the Soviet weapon. A functioning AK was better than a jammed M16. Soldiers understood this truth even if the Pentagon did not want to hear it. The underground market for captured AK-47s flourished. Men traded cigarettes, sea rations, whatever they had, for a reliable weapon. Think about the absurdity of that. The richest, most technologically advanced military power on Earth, and its soldiers were bartering for the enemy's rifles because their own did not work. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The most technologically advanced military in the world was sending its soldiers into battle with rifles that jammed, while the enemy fought with weapons designed to work when covered in mud. And the problem was not isolated. It was systemic. Units in the field were reporting failure rates of up to 30%. Think about what that means operationally. In a rifle platoon of 40 men, 12 of them might have non-functioning weapons at any given time. A platoon that is supposed to bring 40 rifles to bear on the enemy can only deliver 28 rounds of effective fire. Those 12 men are not just combat ineffective. They are liabilities. They need to be protected by the men whose rifles are still working. The entire unit's fighting capacity is degraded, and back in Washington, the people responsible for this disaster were still insisting that the problem was the soldiers. They were not cleaning their rifles properly. They were not maintaining them correctly. The rifle was fine. The troops were the problem. That lie was about to be exposed, because the letters home had done something that all the official reports and classified memos could not. They had reached the families, and the families had reached Congress. The M16's day of reckoning was coming, and it would arrive in the form of a Missouri Democrat with a subpoena and a very short temper. Part 4. The Reckoning. By early 1967, the M16 crisis had breached the walls of the Pentagon and splashed across the American public. Small-town newspapers were running letters from local boys describing rifles that jammed after a few rounds. Parents who had received folded flags instead of their sons were demanding answers. Was the equipment adequate? Could their child's death have been prevented? On March 26, 1967, the Washington Daily News published a major story about M16 reliability problems, featuring interviews with returning soldiers and excerpts from those devastating letters home. The article detonated like a bomb in Washington. The timing was critical. By early 1967, the Vietnam War was already tearing American society apart. Anti-war protests were growing. Public trust in military leadership was eroding. The credibility gap between what the Pentagon said about the war and what soldiers experienced in the field was widening into a chasm. And now here was evidence that the most basic promise a government makes to its soldiers, that their weapons will work, was being broken. The political pressure became impossible to ignore. On May 3, 1967, Representative L. Mendel Rivers of South Carolina, chairman of the House Committee on Armed Services, established a special subcommittee to investigate the M16 rifle program. Rivers was a hawk, a strong supporter of the military and the Vietnam War. The fact that even he felt compelled to investigate tells you how explosive the issue had become. This was not anti-war activists looking for ammunition against the Pentagon. This was the defense establishment's own allies, demanding to know why American soldiers were dying with jammed rifles. He appointed Congressman Richard Icord, a Democrat from Missouri, as chairman. Icord was a meticulous lawyer by training, a man who believed in following evidence wherever it led. He would prove to be the worst nightmare of every bureaucrat who had signed off on the decisions that crippled the M16. The committee's chief counsel, Earl J. Morgan, deserves significant credit as well. Morgan conducted much of the investigative groundwork, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing documents, and building the technical case that would expose the scandal. His legal background gave the investigation the rigor it needed to cut through Pentagon stonewalling. The Icord Committee, as it became known, would conduct what many historians consider the most thorough investigation of a weapons procurement program in congressional history. Over the next 5 months, the committee held hearings in the Rayburn House office building in Washington. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, combat soldiers recently returned from Vietnam, Army generals, Colt engineers, ammunition manufacturers, Pentagon procurement officials, and Eugene Stoner himself. Testimony was given under oath. Documents were subpoenaed. Technical experts were brought in to explain ballistics and engineering in language that congressmen could understand. And what emerged from those hearings was devastating. The committee discovered that every single decision that had transformed Stoner's reliable AR-15 into the failing M16 was documented in internal records. The ammunition change, the rejection of chrome plating, the failure to provide cleaning equipment, the misleading claims about self-cleaning capability. All of it was on paper. More damning still, multiple people had raised red flags before widespread deployment. Colt's engineers had protested the ammunition change in writing. Company officials had explicitly stated they could not guarantee rifle performance with WC-846. Eugene Stoner had recommended chrome plating in his original design specifications and had reiterated this recommendation when the Army began large-scale procurement. Air Force officers who had used the rifle successfully with proper ammunition and maintenance had emphasized the need for cleaning equipment and training. Test reports from Frankfurt Arsenal had shown the 6-fold increase in malfunction rates with ball powder. Every one of these warnings had been ignored, dismissed, buried in the urgency to get rifles to Vietnam and the desire to keep costs down. Eugene Stoner sat before the committee and explained, with the calm precision of an engineer, exactly what had gone wrong. The AR-15 had been designed as a complete weapon system. The rifle, the ammunition, the maintenance procedures worked together as an integrated whole. Changing the ammunition without extensive testing was not a minor substitution. It was a fundamental alteration to the weapon system. He had recommended chrome plating specifically because he understood the direct gas impingement system's vulnerability to corrosion, and he had never, not once, claimed the rifle was self-cleaning. That characterization had been invented by marketing departments and repeated by people who did not understand the weapon. Stoner's testimony was devastating because it was so measured. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers. He simply laid out the engineering facts with the quiet authority of a man who knew his weapon better than anyone alive. The committee members could see it in his face. This was a man watching his life's work being destroyed by incompetence, and there was nothing he could do about it except tell the truth and hope someone would listen this time. Representatives from Colt testified that they had raised concerns about the ammunition change repeatedly. They had stated in writing that they could not guarantee rifle performance with WC-846. They had declared they were no longer accountable for acceptance test results. The Army's response had been to let Colt continue testing rifles with the old ammunition that still worked, while shipping the new ammunition that did not to Vietnam. The committee members were visibly stunned. It was as if a car manufacturer had tested vehicles with premium fuel, passed the safety inspection, and then filled every car on the dealer lot with diesel before selling them. Quality control inspectors testified about finding defects in rifles being shipped to Vietnam. Bolt carriers with improper hardness that would crack under stress. Extractors with weak springs that would fail to pull stuck cases. They had rejected these rifles. Their rejections had been overruled in the urgency to meet production quotas. Let that sink in. Inspectors whose job was to ensure quality had said these rifles should not be shipped, and they were overruled. The rifles went to Vietnam anyway. The committee also heard from a retired officer, Colonel Crossman, whom they had sent to Vietnam as an independent investigator. Crossman had interviewed 250 soldiers and Marines throughout South Vietnam. Fully half reported malfunctions with their M16s. Of those malfunctions, roughly 90% were failures to extract, the stuck case that had become the rifle's signature defect. Crossman found cleaning kits in desperately short supply and concluded that many problems were due to the combination of inadequate maintenance capability and a rifle that demanded meticulous cleaning it was never designed to need. The most powerful testimony came from the soldiers. Men who had survived firefights where their rifles failed described the experience with a rawness that no technical report could match. Marines who had watched friends die while trying to unjam their weapons. Soldiers who had used their jammed M16 as clubs, fighting hand to hand because pulling the trigger did nothing. Men who had carried enemy AK-47s because they could not trust the weapon their own country had given them. One returning Marine described the moment his rifle failed during an ambush. He was point man. The first burst from the tree line killed the man behind him. He raised his M16, pulled the trigger, and felt the bolt lock halfway forward. He said the sound of a jam in combat is unlike any other sound on Earth. It is the absence of the bang you expected, a silence that screams. He survived by diving into a ditch and throwing grenades until his squad could regroup. Another soldier described a patrol where contact was made at less than 15 meters. His platoon opened fire. Within 60 seconds, he could hear the volume of American fire dropping as rifles jammed one after another. He estimated that within 2 minutes of the firefight starting, roughly a third of his platoon's rifles were non-functional. The platoon withdrew, carrying 2 dead and 4 wounded. 3 of those casualties, he believed, were directly attributable to weapon malfunctions. These were not men seeking sympathy. These were combat veterans delivering testimony under oath, their voices flat and controlled, their eyes carrying the weight of what they had seen. Several committee members were visibly shaken by the testimony. The ballistics experts painted the technical picture. WC-846 produced higher port pressures. The increased gas pressure drove the action harder, raising the cyclic rate beyond design specifications. The calcium carbonate residue fouled the chamber and bolt. The lack of chrome plating allowed corrosion to grip cartridge cases. The absence of cleaning equipment and training left soldiers helpless to prevent the accumulation of fouling. Each factor compounded the others in a cascading failure that grew worse with every round fired. All of this had been predictable. Some of it had been predicted. The predictions had been ignored. The financial dimension of the scandal emerged as well. Ball powder was cheaper and faster to produce than stick powder. Olin Matheson had profited handsomely from the ammunition contracts. Eliminating chrome plating had saved production costs per rifle. While the committee found no evidence of outright corruption or bribery, the relationships between military procurement officers and defense contractors had clearly influenced decision-making. Cost and convenience had outweighed combat effectiveness, accountants had overruled engineers, and soldiers had paid the price. By August 1967, The I-Court committee had assembled an overwhelming case. The M16 failures were not the fault of the soldiers. They were not the result of inadequate training alone. They were the direct result of systematic failures in weapons procurement, testing, and deployment. The committee's formal report, released on October 19, 1967, ran to 600 pages. Its conclusions were unsparing. The switch to ball powder ammunition was the primary cause of malfunctions. The lack of chrome plating was the secondary cause. The failure to provide cleaning equipment and training was the tertiary cause. And then came the sentence that echoed through the halls of the Pentagon like a gunshot. The committee stated that the failure of officials with authority in the Army to cause action to be taken to correct the deficiencies of the 5.56 millimeter ammunition bordered on criminal negligence. Criminal negligence. Those two words carried the weight of every jammed rifle, every desperate letter home, every Marine found dead with his weapon torn apart beside him. The report recommended immediate action. Chrome plate all M16 chambers and bores. Develop improved ammunition with reduced fouling. Provide cleaning kits to every soldier carrying an M16. Implement comprehensive training on proper maintenance. Modify the rifle to reduce the cyclic rate. Establish quality control standards that could not be waived for production convenience. Create accountability for procurement decisions that affected soldier safety. The investigation generated enough political pressure that the Army could not continue its previous course. Changes began immediately, even before the final report was released. The fix had been demanded. Now it had to be delivered, and it had to work. Because every day that passed without a solution was another day that American soldiers were fighting with rifles that might betray them at the worst possible moment. The question was whether the damage could be undone, whether a rifle that soldiers had learned to fear could become one they trusted, whether redemption was even possible after what had happened. The answer would come from the production lines, the training camps, and ultimately the jungles of Vietnam. And it would come with a new designation, M16A1, Part 5, Redemption and Reckoning. The Army had already begun the transformation before the I-Court Committee's report was officially released. On February 28, 1967, the improved XM16E1 was officially adopted by the United States Army as the M16A1. The designation change was not cosmetic. It represented a systematic overhaul of every element that had caused the original to fail. The chamber and bore were chrome-plated, the process that Army Ordnance had rejected as too expensive and unnecessary, the process that Eugene Stoner and Colt had recommended from the beginning, was finally implemented. Each chamber was prepared, cleaned, and electroplated with a thin layer of hard chromium. The chrome created a smooth, corrosion-resistant surface. Cartridge cases no longer stuck in corroded chambers. The extraction failures that had killed Marines and soldiers across Vietnam dropped dramatically. A redesigned buffer assembly reduced the cyclic rate back toward the original specifications. The new buffer used heavier weights and stiffer springs to absorb the impact of the bolt carrier, slowing the action cycling from over 900 rounds per minute back down to between 750 and 850. The slower rate meant less violent cycling, reduced stress on components, and critically, less fouling accumulation per unit of time. But the most important change was not mechanical, it was cultural. The self-cleaning myth was killed, publicly, explicitly, and with a vengeance. Army training commands rewrote every instruction manual. The new doctrine emphasized that the M16 required regular, thorough cleaning, especially in combat conditions. Soldiers were instructed to clean the chamber and bore after every firing session. The bolt and bolt carrier needed daily cleaning in the field. And then came one of the most unconventional solutions in military history. The Army produced a comic book, not a technical manual, not a field regulation, a comic book. Officially designated DA Pamphlet 750-30, it used illustrations showing a female character guiding soldiers step by step through how to disassemble, clean, and maintain their M16S. The comic format used clear drawings with arrows showing direction of movement. Text was minimal and simple. A soldier who struggled with dense technical prose could follow the illustrated guide. Why a comic book? Because the Army finally understood something about the men carrying these rifles. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. Many came from backgrounds where reading dense technical manuals was not second nature. A field manual written in bureaucratic prose might sit in a cargo pocket unopened. A comic book with pictures got read. It got passed around. It got dog-eared and stained and carried into the field. And it worked. The comic was distributed throughout Vietnam, and soldiers actually used it. Decades later, veterans would recall the maintenance comic with a mixture of amusement and gratitude. It was silly, it was undignified, and it probably saved lives by getting the cleaning information into the hands of men who needed it in a format they would actually absorb. Comprehensive cleaning kits were manufactured and issued to every soldier carrying an M16. Each kit contained a 3-piece aluminum cleaning rod, a bore brush, a chamber brush specifically designed for the problem areas where cases stuck, pipe cleaners for the gas tube, cotton patches, lubricating oil, and a toothbrush-style brush for the bolt and carrier. The entire kit fit in a small plastic case that could be carried in a cargo pocket. Cleaning became doctrine. Squad leaders inspected weapons daily. Platoon sergeants conducted detailed inspections before and after operations. A dirty rifle was treated as a disciplinary offense. The message was clear and simple. Maintain your weapon and it will work. Neglect it and it will fail you. In 1970, the ammunition was finally improved as well. A new powder, designated WC-844, replaced WC-846 for 5.56 mm ammunition. WC-844 had reduced calcium carbonate content, producing significantly less fouling. The combination of chrome plating and cleaner burning powder effectively solved the extraction problem that had killed so many soldiers. The results were dramatic. By late 1967 and into 1968, units equipped with the M16A1, proper cleaning equipment, and adequate training reported substantial improvements in reliability. A Department of Defense survey in early 1968 sampled 2,100 soldiers and Marines about their combat experience with the M16A1. The transformation was striking. The vast majority reported the rifle functioned reliably. Most reported no significant malfunctions during their previous month of operations. When malfunctions did occur, they were typically minor issues that could be cleared quickly, not the catastrophic extraction failures that had left men defenseless. The weapon that soldiers had called a death trap, that Marines had refused to carry, that men had died cursing, had become trusted and effective. The same basic design, when properly implemented with appropriate ammunition, chrome plating, cleaning equipment, and training, proved to be an excellent combat rifle, light enough to carry all day through jungle heat, high ammunition capacity that kept soldiers in the fight, controllable on automatic fire, devastating terminal ballistics at the close ranges where most jungle combat occurred, everything Eugene Stoner had designed it to be. The rifle went on to serve through the remainder of Vietnam and far beyond. The M16A1 evolved into the M16A2, then the A3, the A4, and eventually the M4 carbine that soldiers carry today. The M16 family has been in continuous American military service for over 60 years, the longest-serving rifle in United States history. It has equipped the armed forces of over 80 nations. It has become, arguably, the most successful military rifle design of the modern era. But that success came at a cost that can never be fully calculated. No one knows exactly how many American soldiers died because their M16 jammed during firefights. The number is certainly in the hundreds. Some estimates suggest it could be higher. Each death was preventable. Each resulted from decisions made in offices thousands of miles from the jungle. Decisions that prioritized dollars over lives, production schedules over testing, institutional pride over engineer expertise, bureaucratic convenience over battlefield reality. The I-Cord Committee's investigation did more than fix a rifle. It fundamentally changed the relationship between Congress and military procurement. Before the M16 scandal, Weapons procurement had been an internal military matter. Congress appropriated the money, but rarely questioned technical decisions. The I-Court investigation shattered that precedent. Congressional oversight of major weapons programs became routine. Soldier feedback was institutionalized. Operational testing in realistic combat conditions became mandatory before full-scale deployment. The practice of granting waivers that allowed defective equipment to be shipped to troops was curtailed. The concept of soldier feedback became institutionalized in ways it never had been before. Before Vietnam, weapons were tested by ordnance experts and evaluated by technical specialists. The opinions of ordinary soldiers who would actually carry the weapons into combat were rarely solicited and often dismissed when offered. The M16 crisis demonstrated that soldiers in combat conditions discovered problems that laboratory testing missed. Their feedback was not merely anecdotal complaint. It was essential operational data. The Army established the Product Quality Deficiency Report System, allowing soldiers to file official reports about equipment failures. These reports were tracked, investigated, and could trigger engineering changes or procurement modifications. The voice of the soldier in the field gained authority it had never possessed before. A private first class in a foxhole could now trigger a review that reached the highest levels of the procurement system. New regulations required that any waiver to acceptance standards be documented, justified in writing, and approved at high levels of authority. The casual granting of waivers that had allowed defective M16s to be shipped to Vietnam became much more difficult. Quality control inspectors gained more authority to reject defective weapons, even if contractors objected. The practice of overruling inspector rejections to meet production quotas was forbidden. These reforms saved lives, not just in Vietnam, but in every conflict that followed. The soldiers who carry reliable weapons into combat today carry them because soldiers in Vietnam carried weapons that failed, and because those failures were investigated publicly and corrected systematically. And now, let us return to where we started. Captain Ray Madonna survived Hill 881. He went on to retire as a lieutenant colonel. Decades later, at a gathering of veterans in San Antonio, Texas, standing before a memorial depicting a scene from the very battle where his Marines' rifles jammed, he told his story publicly. Not for himself, for the men who could not tell it. He spoke of hotel company's 9 dead and 43 wounded on April 30th, 1967. He spoke of Marines who did everything right and whose rifles still failed. He spoke of the modifications that eventually fixed the weapon, and he made sure that the record was clear. His Marines had not failed the M16. The M16 had failed his Marines. The M16 story is ultimately a story of two things: tragedy and redemption. The tragedy was entirely preventable. Eugene Stoner designed a brilliant weapon. He specified the ammunition it should use. He recommended chrome plating to protect it in harsh conditions. Every piece of information needed to deploy the M16 correctly existed before the first rifle was shipped to Vietnam. The warnings were given. They were documented. They were ignored. And this is what makes the M16 story different from most battlefield tragedies. Soldiers die in war. That is the nature of war. They die from enemy fire, from accidents, from disease, from the 1,000 random cruelties of combat. Those deaths, while tragic, are part of the terrible calculus of armed conflict. But the men who died because their M16s jammed did not die from the fog of war. They died from decisions made in conference rooms. They died because someone chose cheaper ammunition. They died because someone decided chrome plating was too expensive. They died because someone believed that marketing slogans about self-cleaning rifles were adequate substitutes for cleaning kits and training. Those were not acts of war. Those were acts of negligence. And the distinction matters. The redemption was earned, but not by the people who caused the problem. It was earned by the soldiers who fought with defective weapons and reported the failures, by the families who sent those letters to Congress, by journalists who published the stories, by the I-Court committee, which investigated relentlessly and refused to accept excuses, and by the engineers and armorers who finally implemented the fixes that should have been standard from day one. The rifle that soldiers called a death trap in 1966 became the rifle they praised by 1970. The weapon that symbolized Pentagon incompetence became proof that accountability and transparency can force improvement. But redemption does not erase the original sin. The men who died with jammed M16 paid for that redemption with their lives. No amount of chrome plating can undo that. There are no shortcuts to reliability. Soldier feedback must be acted upon immediately. Cost savings that compromise performance are not savings when measured in body bags. And when the people making the decisions are not the people paying the consequences, the system is already broken. The M16 failed American soldiers in Vietnam. Then America fixed the M16. That sequence, failure followed by correction, defines both the tragedy and the triumph. The tragedy was preventable. The triumph was earned. And the lessons, if we are honest enough to remember them, are eternal. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm this story is worth sharing. And it is free, unlike the cost of learning these lessons the first time, which was paid in American blood. I will see you in the next one. And remember, the weapons a nation gives its soldiers say everything about what that nation truly values.